There's a specific kind of discomfort that horror films almost never actually achieve. Not the jump scare kind. Not the creepy crawly, monster under the bed kind. I mean the specific cold sweat discomfort where you pause the movie, set the remote down, and genuinely ask yourself, should I be watching this? Should anyone? Faces of Death 2026 is that kind of film. And depending on where you stand on art, ethics, and the murky place where exploitation lives right next to truth-telling, it's either the most important horror film of the decade or the most morally bankrupt one. Possibly both. That's actually the most honest thing I can say about it going in. I've been sitting with this movie for 2 weeks now. I watched it twice. I've read every serious piece of criticism I could find about it, and I've had conversations about it that lasted hours. And I'm still not fully settled on what I think, which, honestly, might be the whole point. So let's talk about it. Before we get into the analysis, let me give you a quick sense of what we're actually dealing with for anyone who hasn't seen it, because describing this film accurately matters. Faces of Death 2026 is a found footage adjacent horror film. Emphasis on adjacent, because it plays with the genre without fully committing to its rules. The film follows Margot, a content moderator at a fictional tech company tasked with reviewing flag videos before they go viral. Over the course of what feels like a very long and very brutal work week, Margot reviews clip after clip of violence, death, accidents, executions, the dark underbelly of user-generated content that most of us never see because people like Margot filter it out before it reaches our feeds. The framing is almost mundane. Fluorescent lighting, a cubicle, coffee getting cold, and then something deeply wrong on a monitor screen. The film alternates between Margot's deteriorating psychological state and the footage she's reviewing. And here's where the film makes its most controversial choice. Some of that footage, the filmmakers have implied, is real. Not staged, not recreated. Actual archival footage of actual deaths. I want to sit with that claim for a moment before we move on, because it changes everything about how we analyze this film. That here's the uncomfortable truth about horror cinema. It has always flirted with reality. Mondo Films in the 60s and 70s pioneered the genre of real death footage wrapped in documentary framing. The original Faces of Death from 1978 built its entire reputation on the claim that its death scenes were authentic. Most weren't, but the myth was powerful enough to make the film notorious for decades. Cannibal Holocaust from 1980 was so convincing that the director Ruggero Deodato had to appear in an Italian court to prove his actors were still alive. But 2026 is a different world. We have LiveLeak. We have Telegram channels. We have the dark web. Real death footage is not hypothetical. It's a browser search away for anyone willing to look. And the question this film forces on you is this. If real footage of real deaths already exists freely online, and if including it in a narrative film creates a meaningful artistic statement about that reality, does the ethical equation change? I don't think it does. And I want to be honest about that, even as I try to argue both sides fairly. There is something categorically different about a person who died, who had a name, who had people who loved them, who had no idea their final moments would be edited into a horror movie for entertainment, being used as a prop in someone else's artistic vision, regardless of how sophisticated that vision is. That's not a small thing. That's actually a pretty serious violation of something fundamental about human dignity. But, and this is where the film gets genuinely interesting, is it less of a violation when those same clips already exist on the open internet? Is the filmmaker who embeds them in a narrative context that forces the audience to confront why they're watching doing something worse than the platforms that host them passively, without comment, without consequence? I don't have a clean answer. I don't think anyone does. Let's talk about Margot, because she is the actual heart of this film and the reason it works as well as it does, even when everything else about it feels deeply questionable. Margot is not a horror protagonist in the traditional sense. She doesn't discover a monster. She doesn't uncover a conspiracy. She doesn't fight back. She just watches. Day after day, clip after clip, she sits in front of a screen and makes decisions about what the rest of the world gets to see, and the film is extraordinarily precise about the psychological toll that takes. What the film understands And what makes Margot such a smart piece of character writing is that there is no safe distance from real violence. We have this collective fantasy that consuming violent content from behind a screen creates a kind of immunity, like watching through glass, like the glass protects you from what's on the other side. Content moderators, no, that's not true. There's real research from organizations like the Trauma Research Foundation and countless independent studies showing that content moderation is one of the most psychologically damaging jobs in the modern tech economy. People who do this work develop PTSD symptoms at alarming rates. The exposure accumulates. It doesn't stay on the other side of the screen. Margot's deterioration over the course of the film is filmed with this horrible, quiet realism. She stops sleeping. She starts seeing the clips in her peripheral vision during ordinary moments, at a traffic light, in the shower, in the face of someone she loves. And the film never explains this with dramatic music or expressionist visuals. It just shows you her face changing, something going out behind her eyes, while something else, darker and more attentive, takes up residence. She is you. That's the whole point. She is you if you had no choice but to look. And the film's uncomfortable implication is that maybe you already are choosing to look on social media, on news sites, in the viral clips that circulate for a day before everyone moves on, just with enough distance to pretend you're not. The choice to make Margot a content moderator rather than, say, a detective or a journalist is one of the most deliberately modern things this film does. Content moderation is infrastructure. It's the invisible labor that makes the internet livable for the rest of us. And the fact that we barely think about it, barely pay attention to the humans doing it, is itself a kind of moral failure the film is quietly indicting. This film doesn't exist in a vacuum. Horror has been having this argument with itself for its entire history, and it's worth placing Faces of Death 2026 in that lineage, because context matters. Think about what Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, did in 1986. A film so committed to the banal, unglamorous texture of violence that it was initially denied a rating entirely. No swelling score, no moral resolution, no punishment that feels earned. Just the deadness of it. Critics hated it. Now it's considered a landmark. Think about Martyrs, the 2008 French film, not the pale American remake, which took the torture porn genre that Saw had built into a cultural phenomenon and used it to make an argument about transcendence and suffering that was genuinely philosophical, even if the road to get there was almost unwatchable. I know people who consider it a masterpiece. I know people who consider it trauma they didn't consent to. Both of those responses are legitimate. Think about Man Bites Dog, or Irreversible, or Funny Games. Films that interrogated audience complicity in violent entertainment by refusing to let the violence be entertaining. Michael Hanke's Funny Games is practically a lecture at times, almost annoyingly self-righteous about it. But the central question it poses is real. Why did you buy a ticket to watch people be terrorized? Faces of Death 2026 is in conversation with all of those films. Where it differs, and why it's more controversial than any of them, is that those films used fiction as their currency. They created simulated violence to ask questions about real violence. This film, by importing actual death footage into its narrative, removes that buffer entirely. And in doing so, it forces the question those other films were only able to gesture at, and I want to spend some time on this distinction, because I think it's where most of the interesting disagreement actually lives. When we watch a horror film, even an extraordinarily violent one, there's a psychological contract in place. We know it's fake. The actor is going home after the shoot. The blood is corn syrup. The body is getting up when the director calls cut. That knowledge creates the space in which horror can be pleasurable, cathartic, even meaningful. It's why we scream and laugh at the same time. The fear is real, but the stakes are not. And that gap is where the genre operates. Real footage collapses that gap. There's a reason why watching news footage of actual disasters feels categorically different from watching a disaster movie, even when the disaster movie has a bigger budget and more impressive special effects. The psychological response to real death is not aesthetic. It activates something older and more urgent than our capacity for artistic appreciation. And the film knows this. The way it deploys the real footage, if that's what it is precisely calibrated to exploit that gap in your defenses. You're watching a horror movie. Your brain is in horror movie mode. And then something lands differently, registers differently, and some part of you that processes reality as distinct from fiction starts sending up a signal. Something is wrong here. This isn't like the rest. That sensation, that specific wrongness, is either the film's greatest achievement or its greatest violation, depending on your framework. Is it art to induce that sensation? Is it manipulation? Is there a difference? I lean toward thinking that the sensation itself has value. That the discomfort of having your horror movie detachment punctured by something genuinely real is an experience worth having. Not because suffering is good, but because that detachment is a kind of lie we tell ourselves about our relationship to violence in media, and having it punctured might actually teach us something. But I hold that position loosely because I'm aware it can also just be a sophisticated rationalization for something that doesn't deserve okay. Let's get into the argument that I think is at the actual center of the controversy around this film. Is Faces of Death 2026 making a genuine statement about the way modern internet culture has normalized exposure to violent content? Or is it just using the language of social commentary as a fig leaf for shock value that would otherwise be indefensible? The case for genuine commentary is strong. The film is rigorously structured around its thesis. Margot's arc is not random. It's a precise illustration of the psychological literature on vicarious trauma. The corporate setting is not accidental. It frames content moderation as a system, an industry, something we've all opted into as consumers without thinking about who absorbs the cost. The fact that the real footage is never labeled, never distinguished from the stage footage, is a deliberate choice that implicates the audience in a specific way. You watched all of it the same way, and the film is asking you to sit with what that says about you. That's not nothing. That's actually a coherent artistic argument, executed with discipline and real craft. The case against is also strong. The filmmakers made money from this. People bought tickets and streaming subscriptions to watch real people die. Whatever the artistic intention, the economic reality is that human death footage was monetized, and the victims of that footage and their families received nothing and were consulted not at all. The sophistication of the framing doesn't change that transaction. A more scrupulous filmmaker making the same argument could have used stage footage or archival footage with proper context, or a different formal strategy entirely. The choice to use what they used is not necessary. It's a choice. And here's the thing about shock value. It always disguises itself as something more. Every piece of genuine exploitation has a theoretical justification available to it. The original Mondo films dressed themselves in the language of anthropology. The original Faces of Death called itself a document of mortality. The justification doesn't validate the act. It just makes the act easier to defend at a dinner party. I think the truth is that Faces of Death 2026 is both things simultaneously, and that the bothness is actually what makes it interesting. It's genuinely thoughtful, and it's genuinely exploitative. Those are not mutually exclusive categories, and the film's refusal to cleanly separate them might itself be part of the statement it's making about a culture that can no longer cleanly separate them either. There's a moment late in the film. I'm going to be deliberately vague because I don't want to spoil it, but you'll know it when you get there, where Margot looks directly into the camera. Not at a monitor, not at a supervisor, at the camera, at us. It's held for an uncomfortably long time. Long enough to become something other than a stylistic choice. Long enough to become an accusation. The film's argument, ultimately, is not really about content moderation. It's not even really about horror movies. It's about the relationship between the people who consume violent content and the ecosystem that exists to supply them. Margot is that ecosystem's human face, exhausted, damaged, invisible. And in that final look, the film is asking, do you see her? Have you ever? That question lands differently depending on your relationship to the internet. If you've never sought out disturbing content, you might feel unfairly implicated. If you've spent time in corners of the internet where violent content circulates freely, and many of us have, whether we sought it out or just stumbled into it, you might feel the film is looking at you with something uncomfortably close to accuracy. The horror genre has a long tradition of using monsters as mirrors, as externalizations of fears and anxieties the culture can't look at directly. What makes Faces of Death 2026 different, and what makes it uncomfortable in a way that survives analysis, is that the monster it's holding up isn't supernatural. It's infrastructural. It's the content pipeline. It's the attention economy. It's the system that turns human suffering into engagement metrics. And it's a system that the audience watching this film is already inside. Oh, what do I actually think? After 2 weeks, 2 viewings, and more conversations than I probably needed to have about this, I think Faces of Death 2026 is a genuinely important film that made at least one decision it had no right to make. I think it asks questions that deserve to be asked and uses at least some methods that don't deserve to be used. I think Margot is one of the most precisely observed characters in recent horror cinema. And I think the ethical violation at its center doesn't disappear just because the film is smart enough to know it's committing one. What I don't think is that the answer is easy. I've seen critics dismiss this film as pure exploitation, and I think that's lazy. I've seen others defend it as unambiguous art, and I think that's dishonest. The film is operating in a space where the comfortable categories don't quite work, and I think that's actually the space it wants to operate in. It wants to be unresolvable. It wants to leave you sitting in the discomfort. Whether that's profound or whether it's a con is a question I'll leave with you. What I can say is that 2 weeks later, I'm still thinking about Margot's face in that cubicle, the cold coffee going untouched, the thing behind her eyes going quiet. And most horror films don't do that. Most horror films are over the moment the credits roll. This one followed me home. I'm still not sure I wanted it to. But here we are. If you've seen it, tell me in the comments where you landed. Not just whether you liked it, where you landed on the actual question it's asking. Because I think that answer says something real about where you stand on all of it. The internet, the content, the invisible people who absorb the cost of what the rest of us scroll past without thinking. I'll see you in the next one.